So if you just joined us, you're in the right place for our Research Questions and Literature Reviews webinar. This is one of several webinars in our EdD in Progress series. It happens to be a webinar that ties very directly into assignment for Leadership 724. So we are going to look at this particular assignment in depth after we do a discussion about research questions. And research questions are a very important aspect of your time in the program because the end assignment, the terminal project, if you will, of the EdD dissertation is to do a research study, write about it, and then share it with the world. So the degree program is designed to prepare you for this, to guide you through different tasks, and to have you write different components as part of your assignments that you can then combine into your eventual EdD dissertation. So let's differentiate between a couple key things. One is an interview question or prompt. These are the specific statements or questions that you pose directly to research participants to collect data. For example, I might sit down in the same room with you and ask, so could you please tell me about your time doing XYZ? Or I might call you on the phone and say, have you ever done X? So interview questions or prompts. These are being posed to a person. A research questionnaire is a research instrument that contains a series of questions or prompts. This could be about demographics, but also about things like, oh, do you like this? Or on a scale of 1 to 10, how do you feel about this? With 10 being high and 1 being not at all. Now, a research questionnaire can be delivered in multiple formats, including as an online survey or as a paper survey, or it could be delivered as a list of questions that are asked in an interview. And the purpose of having a questionnaire is so that you have a standardized resource that you can ask and make sure that you're asking the same core questions. Now, there are different types of research questionnaires and different types of interviews that you can do. So if you have what are called open-ended questions, you are having questions where there's an opportunity for follow-up. If you have closed questions, basically once they respond, you move on. And depending on the questionnaire, you might be giving the answerer the opportunity to select numbers, like in a Likert scale. Okay, 1 to 5, 1 means this, 5 means that. Or you might be asking them to fill in the blank or even write a paragraph. So the exact details, yeah, those are all going to be research questionnaires if the core elements are standardized. Now, research questions, they're often confused with interview questions and with research questionnaires because in the formal language that we're using in APA style, a research question is one of the larger questions that you're using data and data analysis to answer. If it's something where you can just ask one person and they give an answer and you know it, then that's an interview question, not a research question. And the research questions are a bigger picture thing. It may also be helpful to differentiate between two related concepts, action research and pure or basic research. And this is partly a question of what exactly you're trying to do in the study, and also what kinds of things you need to connect it to. So as an example of action research, so my late grandfather worked in a shipyard in World War II, and they had a research project to see if they could build a ship faster if they used riveting or they used welding. So the action that they were trying to do was to make sure they were doing the fastest thing. And the reason they had to do research was, well, they hadn't tried the welding before. They hadn't done it on these big projects, new designs and things like that. So they did a couple builds and to work out the kinks and train the crews. And then they did some builds with the train crews and compared that to the records and figured out, oh, if we give the crews this training, it's much faster. If we skip the training, it's slower and we get more problems. So that is an example of action research. Now, of course, there are things that do not require war being on to research. And a common one that comes up in healthcare settings is to look and see, okay, what is the patient readmittance rate? If someone comes and you treat them and you give them a particular treatment, do they come back more often or less often than if you didn't do it? And that's something where, well, if you're giving them things that they're just not taking, then that's inefficient financially. If you're giving them something that's designed to avoid an infection, but they're getting infected anyway, that is a potentially life-threatening problem. So medical action research, something that one of our EdD students worked on a couple years ago, was looking at a particular method of math instruction that they wanted to evaluate with a particular subpopulation of students. And the exact subpopulation that doesn't matter. What mattered is they had an idea, but before they deployed this idea district-wide, they wanted to know, does this actually work? And does it work better than these alternatives that we already have? And so their study was designed to find out, okay, does it work and how well? And therefore, to be able to produce recommendations on what to do. So action research. Now, you may notice that I'm talking about steps where they do something afterwards, that action. So this is as opposed to pure, or some will say basic research. And it's not that they can't feed into each other, they very often do, but that if we're asking the question of, okay, for what you are doing right now, will this enable an action to be done directly, or is there another step that would need to take place? And so pure or basic research is usually focused more on the, okay, we're trying to understand something. And a later stage might use that understanding to do something. For example, uh, going back to my grandfather's example there, so one of the things that you had to do in the shipyard is you had to look at the organization of the workflow. And one of the things that they found out was that the order mattered very much. If you started at one end of the ship and you went to the next welding things, any things where things weren't quite the same size, didn't quite line up, you could fix those as you go. But if you started building both ends of the ship separately and met in the middle, things just would not line up, and they would not line up in a way that made it hard to bridge that, or potentially introduced a problem there. Now, an action research approach to that problem would have said, okay, well, let's try these other things and compare them and see if they work up. What they did there is they said, okay, hold on, let's understand, how did we get here? What led us to have this problem? And they saw, oh, okay, so they are trying to maximize the shipbuilding rate. There's a war going on, lots of ships are getting sunk. We're trying to build ships faster. So they tried having more people working at the same time on the same ship, and then this problem came up. And by looking at that, by understanding the phenomenon, they realized, oh, so there's this old historical practice of starting at one end and going to the other one. Um, but we found other things like um, other types of assembly line research, assembly line manufacturing, where there are multiple components that are built simultaneous and then come together. And that's actually what they ended up figuring out. You could make a section of the ship separately and have people working on all those different sections. And by joining those together in a final set of stages, just as when you're building from one end to the other, you can account for all those minor imperfections, differences in measurements and stuff, and line things up in the end. Now, it was a separate step after they came to the realization of, oh, there's this way of doing things that Now that we know we were only doing this because of this, we can do this and get around the problem. And they had to test to make sure that actually worked. But the pure research was, hold on, let's understand what we're doing in the shipyard and why that's being done, and then see, is that working for us? Now, some examples of action research questions versus pure or basic research questions. You'll also see basic science research questions tossed around for the last one. So, action research questions often have wordings like, what are the practice recommendations of this thing for that? Or what are the most common methods for this thing used by this group? Or what is the most effective teaching method to use with this particular population of students? Now, the pure or basic science research questions are usually a bit more abstract because you're trying to understand a phenomenon. And then a later step is to zero in and say, okay, well, based on that, if we look at the specific case, what can we do? So, for example, how do gases behave in a vacuum? Now, if you were, say, in a spaceship and you're saying, okay, well, we open this door and we want to know is all the air going to run out? If you're doing it while you're on the spaceship and you're going to open the door, that is an action thing. But if you're just speculating, generally, how does a gas behave in the vacuum? That would be the basic science research version of that question. Fine. Another thing, okay, what are the conditions necessary for nuclear fusion in the interior of Alpha Centauri? Now, you might say, but wait, isn't that an action thing? Well, it is specific, but in practice, if we figure out the conditions necessary for nuclear fusion in the interior of our nearest stellar neighbor, Alpha Centauri, about 4 light years away, well, are we actually going to be able to change that with that knowledge? No. And that's why it's pure research or basic science research rather than action research in this instance. Similarly, if you're just investigating, well, how do these teaching methods affect students' in class concentration and focus? That's not asking the question, and is this more effective than something else? It's saying, well, let's find out what's going on first. And then often the next step would be to say, okay, well, based on that understanding, let's formulate an action question that we can do in the next study. So pure or basic research often precedes action research. And when you're working in a more mature field where there's been a lot of prior research, there may be lots of other basic research that feeds into that. Common example is when you start bringing in psychology research into, say, a human resources setting. And it's not that you're running a study to find out basic principles of human behavior, but then you're applying those earlier findings to your action research. So, a couple rules of thumbs about research questions. For your dissertation, you want your research questions to be actionable, that there's something practical that can be done with the response. You also want them to be arguable, meaning they're not easily answerable with current knowledge and literature. It, you would not want to have a research question like, oh, well, what is the freezing temperature of water at um, sea level at this particular latitude and longitude? Because that's the kind of thing that you more or less you can look up. And it's not going to be something where we really need to do a big study at this point. There's lots of data on that already. Now, if it was, well, okay, what's the boiling point of water going to be in space? Well, we could look up and see if any astronauts have actually tested this. But if not, if the answer is not, then certainly we could have a research question about that because our literature search find, oh, no one's written this. All right, what should be clear? By that we mean containing enough specifics to orient the reader. Looking at this, uh, the second from the bottom question, what are the conditions necessary for nuclear fusion in the interior of Alpha Centauri? That's a very different question from what are the conditions in the interior of Alpha Centauri? Stars are big. There's lots of stuff going on. Making it more specific gives us a chance to actually answer it in the time and space available. It should also be complex enough to merit a detailed study, not something where just a yes or no. if your research question was, do people like getting money? Well, first of all, we can probably answer that with a quick literature search, and I think the answer would be yes, definitely. But also, it would just be yes. And it's like, okay, well, now that we've learned that, what can we actually do differently? And if it was, how much are people willing to do for money, or for different amounts of money? Well, that gets really interesting. All right, an important thing that you will probably get some feedback on this area after you submit this next assignment that we're discussing. Feasible, meaning it's feasible to answer with your available time and other resources. I all the time see research questions and proposals for studies that I'm like, oh, this is something that's very important, but this is going to require a multi-year study to determine. And the question then becomes, well, is there a subset of this, something more specific that you could do that would be appropriate scale and scope for a doctoral dissertation, but have you done in 6 months to a year? Because I think we all agree that there's a lot that you can do with the doctorate that's easier when you're not working on the doctorate. And if you are, say, working in a school district where you have a pay raise for the doctorate, of course, you want to take the doctorate sooner rather than later and get that pay raise. Awesome. So there's often a bit of kind of reality checking where your faculty will offer comments. They're not saying we don't like the idea or you can't do it, but that they want to steer you towards, well, hold on, is this really how large you want to make this, or can we find a smaller project that will be easier to do well and in depth and finish in a concise amount of time? For that reason, you want your research questions to focus on a single problem or issue. You can certainly have multiple questions, but we want the research question, each research question to focus on a single problem or issue. If you're posing the same question for related problems, that's fine, but give us a separate question for that. Hierarchical, a sense of how they relate. So you may have come across the term primary research question versus secondary research question, maybe even seen tertiary research question. So these are different levels, and the primary research questions are the most important ones. But sometimes they're things that you need to answer and able to get to that point. And so those would be secondary research questions. And for some very large, big studies, usually but not always longitudinal in nature, you might also have tertiary research questions that you need to answer. And those aren't things where you can just ask the interviewees. You need to collect data and analyze it to answer each of these levels. Should be relevant to your field of study or practice. And this is something where this is partly something we emphasize because the EdD and the DMP are professional doctorates, and it should be grounded in practice and supporting practice, but also that it be something where you can look and people will see, oh, yes, that is useful, that is important. This isn't just idle speculation. We want this to be researchable using primary or secondary sources. There are genres of research where you might be using tertiary literature, but probably not the kinds that you do for the EdD or DNP. So if you have a question about that, check with your faculty person. We'll probably steer you towards primary or secondary sources. And that's partly because the further you get away from the original source, the easier it is for distortions to creep in. And finally, we want this to be specific, for your questions to be specific enough to be answered thoroughly, given the means and resources that you have at your disposal. So let's talk about the way that a research question might evolve. And usually you start very broad and get more specific. And look, if we started with the question, what do college students eat? Well, that's very open in terms of geography, and assessing the habits of college students around the world is going to be a lot of work. So one of the first things I'd suggest is, okay, let's be specific about the geography and say, okay, what do US college students eat? And this would be a very long list because we have more than 300 million people in the United States and a lot of college students in there. And with all the different cultures and backgrounds in the US, you can bet that they eat a lot of foods from different cuisines. So you might then say, okay, well, I'm trying to cut that down to size. Let me make it what are the most common foods eaten by US college students? And so you could say do a survey and tabulate those things. But then say, okay, well, hold on. Are we really interested in the most common things, or do you want to know what their favorite foods are? Because, to pick an example, pasta and ramen are cheap. And so people might buy them because they don't have as much money in their budget for food. But that doesn't necessarily mean that's something that they want. So you might say, okay, well, we're going to change our question to what are the favorite foods eaten by US college students? Now, if you ask me what my favorite foods are, you might learn that my favorite dessert is baklava. Baklava is delicious. When I was in Marseille, I found a store that had more than 24 varieties of baklava for sale. I only bought like 8 of them to try in a great amount of self-restraint and enjoyed them very much. But do I eat baklava all the time? No, it's very rich food. It's an occasional treat. Might take the time once a year to make it. But so what are you trying to do with the answer? So what's the problem or issue that you're addressing? And so that might lead you to narrow the scope from, okay, what are the favorite foods eaten by US college students to what are the most effective and cost-efficient foods to advertise at events to attract US college students. So now we have a much more clear thing. We're getting narrow in terms of demographics, in terms of geography, purpose, and that's good, but it's also possible to go too far. And for an example of a research question that is really too specific to do a dissertation on, what are the most effective and cost-efficient foods to advertise at events to attract freshman US college students to the Hardin Administration Building at Abilene Christian University? Now, if you're an event planner for the college, you might want to know that. Will it have much applicability outside of ACU? Probably not. Is it enough to merit a doctoral dissertation? I think it's a little bit too narrow. So while in general, you'll probably receive a lot of feedback to make your questions more specific and narrow them, also don't be surprised if you get asked to broaden something because you went a step too far. Nothing wrong with that. Writing a dissertation is in part a process of continual rewriting as you get more specific and more detailed. All right, so let's talk about the assignment that we're going to focus on today. And this is Leadership in Diverse Contexts. Next, week 3 assignment, the feedback, reflection, and question proposal. Now, there's a preamble to this assignment, a preamble being a kind of introduction that tells you about the kinds of things you're going to do, but is not part of the direct instruction saying, do X. So it starts out with a feedback reflection, saying, okay, well, academic environments, there's based on growth through feedback, and peer-reviewed journals are respected because each writer's work is subject to the scrutiny of colleagues. Academicians must attend to feedback carefully and respond with appropriate, thoughtful revisions. Yep, no objections there. Doctoral students begin this practice through careful attention to professors' feedback. Like seasoned academicians, successful students will demonstrate this attention through improvements in their written work. So while this is a preamble to the assignment, it is also, in a way, saying, hey, we're going to be giving you feedback. We would like you to follow it. There's also the question proposal here, again, part of the preamble. It says, in preparation for your coming literature review, like be aware you're going to be doing a literature review assignment, you will need to develop a good research question that includes both diversity and leadership elements. This question must be grounded in a real-world problem, and it must be a logical next step from the existing research. So you need to ground this in some way, shape, or form in what's been researched before and being published about. Have to tie it into that real world problem. And also we've got diversity and leadership elements to include. And now we get to the instructions themselves, where there's the notion, refer to previous assignment feedback from this or previous courses and describe. And I'll just tell you, I have reformatted this slightly from how it is presented on the course website so that you can see each point in a different bullet. Describe what you have learned from this feedback, what you still need to learn, and how you can use the feedback to refine your future assignments. In addition, you need to state the research question you intend to use for the literature review, which is coming up in Module 5, and some requirements. Question must include both diversity and leadership elements. Okay, yep, read about those early. It must connect to a specific problem of practice, and it must, to the best of your knowledge right now, be a logical next step from existing research. And for this assignment, you should have a brief supporting statement of 1 to 3 sentences about why this question is important. And then they give an outline that basically provides this with a little bit of a breakdown. And then the grading rubric repeats that. And let me give you some additional guidance. So I mentioned earlier that there's some types of research where the research questions do get answered by searching and analyzing the literature. But that's usually not going to be the case with an ACU EdD dissertation. And because of this, because you're usually not writing a literature review or meta-analysis as the study itself, the purpose of the literature review that you write as your chapter 2 is usually to discover and assess the relevant information out there in the literature to first identify gaps in the extant literature, especially those related to the specific problem you're examining. Make sure that your research questions are addressing a current gap, that this isn't something someone's answered before or hasn't answered to satisfaction. You could be repeating a research question that someone already explored, but they did it in a very different context. Or you could be repeating a research question that they did with a very small group, and you're trying to figure out, does this generalize to the broader population? You also want to help determine the most appropriate research methods and design for answering your research questions by looking and see, okay, well, how have people tried to answer similar questions before? And you also want to position your study in relation to what has been previously researched and determined, which is to say, to acknowledge what has come before and how your study does or doesn't add to that. It's usually going to be, oh, you are complementing this research, you are following up on this, or you're filling this gap that was identified by someone. Okay, we are doing great for time here, moving right along. And because we're only 30 minutes in, I think we can spend some time on doing up a sample outline without holding people late. And I think we'll still be able to give you some free time back in the schedule. So this assignment starts with the feedback reflection. So I've provided a couple formulas to illustrate how you might go about this. For the charge to cite key feedback for the previous work, well, in week 2, I received instructor feedback that I should be more specific and rely less on direct quotes. Therefore, I have, and then describe whatever you're doing. Or if you're referring to a previous class, oh, in Leadership 714, I received several suggestions to do X. As a result, I have done this. And what this wording does is it says, all right, so here's the feedback that I'm referring to, and here's the action. Now, you may have done one thing at the time and now changed your mind, or you may have done that thing and now realized, oh, that worked very well, so I'm going to do it again, or I'm going to make it part of my routine. So you might use a formula like, after trying this, I have decided to make this change. Or if you talked about this with someone else, after discussing this feedback with my supervisor at work, I have decided to make this a part of my routine, and I have drafted a checklist to make sure that I do that. Some other formulas that might be helpful. My draft research question is this thing. So just introduce it, say, okay, it's not final yet, it's a draft research question, and here it is. Do make sure to include a question mark at the end. You'd be surprised how often people leave that one out. You might have a statement like XYZ is designed to provide key understanding needed to address this issue, which is a major problem practice affecting this group. Or you might use wording like, this research question aligns with a recommendation by this author to investigate this phenomenon using this tool. And that's something that, based on the reading you've done so far, you might have some ideas, or you might discover that after doing the literature review, that you revise your research question so that you can align it with something else. All right, for this next section, we are going to go ahead and we're going to grab a copy of the APA course paper template. If you haven't used this template before, it does a lot of the formatting for you already. It has some built-in styles that make it easy and relatively fast to do many formatting things. In our case here, we are going to be just working with a blank copy of the course paper template, and we are going to be specifically looking at what you might put in here. And just to start us out, I'm going to go to the Review tab. Let me go ahead and share my screen there. You should now see Microsoft Word, and you'll see that there are these instructions on the side. And I'm going to go to Review and select Delete all comments in document. So those are all gone. I also have some placeholders and an abstract, and this particular assignment doesn't require an abstract. So I'm just going to select that and delete that whole page. And this placeholder text, I'll go ahead and select that and delete it too. And for the references, well, I'm going to fill in a reference section there, so let me add that as well. All right. So let us go to the cover page here. And, well, what is this assignment? Well, we are doing a particular assignment here, and something that you can always do is just call your assignment the name of the assignment. Doesn't matter that someone else might have the exact same idea. So our assignment here, feedback, reflection, and question proposal. Okay, that's informative. And go ahead and fill in the rest of your details here. We're going to want that title again at the top of the page. And let's see what we have to do. Well, if we go back to the slides here, let's look at the instructions here. All right, well, the instructor has given us an outline here already, so great, let's just go ahead and borrow that. You don't want to reinvent the wheel. If they've given you an exact order to follow, we can certainly start by having that and following it. So as I go ahead and type this out here, all right, so I can cite more than one course. So all right, for this one, and you can classify that. And okay, well, we have 3 points here out of the assignment that's going into that feedback reflection. So let's talk about what you might discuss. Well, okay, what did people give? And you could even add, how did you initially react? And okay, how is this different from what came before? Now, examples of things there, how you receive feedback in the workplace depends tremendously based on the workplace, the individuals involved, their cultural backgrounds, and so forth. I happen to live in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where there is often a more communication between the lines that some people manifest to what coastal residents tend to call passive aggressiveness, and other people may call polite, and there are other terms for that. But if you're used to one type of feedback from your prior experiences and you get another type that you're not done, often people react negatively to that in the short term. So, for example, I had a student tell me that they had always gotten A's before, and they got their first B in Leadership 701. And so if something like that applied to you, and look, what was your initial reaction? How did that change? And okay, how do you feel about it now? Now, part of my other life, I used to host the auditions for the Metropolitan Opera's National Council. And there were some judges who would just tell you, okay, work on this, that, and the other thing. And some people would phrase similar feedback in terms of, and this was wrong or this was bad. And these can land very differently. Now, in a different audition that I did one time, someone made a comment, and at the time I was upset. And the comment was that I had gone flat on a note. And later I'm like, okay, yes, I should have paid more attention there, worked on that with my teacher or something like that. But at the time, my reaction was, really? I just sing for you, and it's one fraction of a note that you're complaining about? And how I feel about it now is that, okay, you know what? I was not receptive to that feedback then. And I don't know what your experience will be, but I bet that how you respond to some of the feedback, depending on how it was worded or how it was voiced or what had come before, could have a very strong difference on what you choose to do or what you choose to do next. And that's where this one comes in. In the future, I will. And it's not just saying, I will do this, but giving us a justification, the because. Now, as an example in that, there's one time when I was playing an orchestra and I mentioned to the very senior musician next to me, I said, oh, I played that a little flat. And they said, well, don't do that. And at the time I thought, wait, what? But afterwards they're like, actually, they're saying, okay, well, you've identified the problem. You know what to do. Don't play flat. And it's a little bit of a simplification, but if this comes up again, I'm like, oh, hold on, let me compensate. So I'm not just talking about it, doing something about it. All right, so usually people don't have terribly much trouble with 2B. So let's spend our last couple minutes on 2A here. Now the prompt for 2A, state your proposed research question at this point. The question must include both diversity and leadership elements. Now I mentioned before that you can have multiple research questions, but that there's a hierarchy. So in this case, while you may later subdivide it, you're being asked for, okay, what's the most important research question that you want to answer it right now? This is your proposed research question or your draft proposed research question. And so let's look at a couple things that might come up. So let's say we're taking the musical context I was talking about earlier in an orchestra. And let's say that we have an issue of unpopular conductors. The orchestra musicians don't like the conductor, so they complain, they come late, whatever is going on. And so we have a question of, okay, so let's say it's what are the most important qualities for an orchestral conductor? Now, if we just had that, we'd be missing the diversity element and the leadership element. Even though a conductor is a sort of leader, we're not really addressing that in a question. So let's be more specific. In a in a collegiate orchestra with a, let's say, socioeconomically diverse roster, what are the most important qualities from an orchestral conductor from the perspective of the players on the roster? So not what does the audience think, not what do the managers think, but what do the actual players think? And we could make this more specific. We could have this in a U.S. collegiate orchestra, so we're not looking at, say, an orchestra in the Philippines or Colombia, and say, okay, all right, so we've introduced a diversity element, the fact that the members of the orchestra are socioeconomically diverse, and we have leadership. And well, maybe we want to be more specific because there could be qualities like, are they sexy? Which all I'll say is that when Gustave Dudamel was hired for the LA Philharmonic, that there were a lot of headlines that ran that said, "Oh, this conductor is making music sexy again." So that may be for the journalists. Is it going to be important for the orchestra players? I don't know. But if it's something that you're investigating, certainly tell us more about that. So you could certainly be more specific and say, okay, what are the most important qualities of leadership? Or say, what are the most important leadership attributes? And perhaps even specify a particular thing. If you said, if you're asking this question, what are the most important Clifton strengths? So then you're saying, okay, we're using that particular lens and very likely that instrument as well to look and see what are these qualities that the conductors that people like have and what they don't. Now, if we're continuing with this analogy here, then the relevant problem of practice is probably going to be college orchestras have a lot of turnover, and it's not great when your most experienced players decide to go and do something else. And that can affect the recruitment, it can affect the kind of repertoire you do, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, the connections to the articles that you found so far. So make sure that you are grounding this with the literature. You're, if this is something that someone else has investigated and part of us, tell us about that. If it's something where they said this is a gap, where this is an area that requires more research, tell us that. If you're reusing a particular question, tell us where it came from, and then what the new context you're applying it to is. So that's our webinar for today. I'm happy to answer any questions or to talk about any of these elements in more detail, but this is one of those assignments where if you go in understanding exactly what you're going to do and you understand what research questions are and how this relates to your problem, and that you're going to have to write a literature review on this eventually. It's not a lengthy assignment to do, but you want to make sure that you are just as specific as you need to be. And that if your professor has to kind of rein you back to say, okay, that's too granular, be a little bit broader, that's an easy change to make. So I hope this is helpful. We will call this as pause here, and then the next webinar will be starting on the hour.